Marcus Cole lived in a quiet neighborhood where the streets were lined with small houses, tall trees, and children's laughter in the evenings. To anyone passing by, Marcus seemed like an ordinary man who minded his own business. He kept to himself most of the time, but he was never unfriendly. He always greeted his neighbors with a nod or a smile, and everyone recognized him for one special reason: his dog. The dog, a large black German shepherd named Shadow, was Marcus's constant companion. Every morning, the two could be seen walking together along the sidewalks, Shadow trotting proudly at his side. The neighbors loved Shadow because he was gentle with children, always wagging his tail and letting kids pet him. For Marcus, Shadow was more than just a dog. He was a friend, a protector, and in many ways, the piece of family that Marcus had chosen for himself. Most people never asked Marcus much about his past. He was polite but quiet, and when conversations turned to careers or old jobs, he would simply say, "I worked in the service for a while." His modest tone made people think he had been in the army or some other branch of the military, but nobody pressed him for details. They respected his privacy. What the neighbors didn't know was that Marcus had once lived a life few could imagine. He had spent more than 2 decades in the Delta Force, the U.S. military's most elite special operations unit. He had been sent into war zones and foreign lands, completing missions that were classified even from other soldiers. His name had once been whispered with respect in military circles, his reputation built on skills that only the best of the best could master. But Marcus had left that life behind. After years of fighting, danger, and loss, he had chosen peace. He moved into this small neighborhood because it was quiet and safe. He no longer wanted to be a commander or a soldier. He wanted to be just a man, someone who could wake up to calm mornings, drink coffee on the porch, and walk his dog without worrying about bullets or battlefields. Shadow had been the one who helped him through the difficult transition from war to peace. Training the dog, bonding with him, and caring for him gave Marcus purpose again when he felt lost after retirement. Shadow had a story of his own. Marcus had rescued him from a shelter years ago. The dog had been abandoned, scared, and thin when Marcus first saw him. Something in Shadow's eyes reminded Marcus of soldiers he had seen overseas, wounded, weary, but still holding on. He brought the dog home that very day. Since then, Shadow had become his shadow in truth, following him everywhere, guarding him, and offering him the loyalty that only a dog can give. The bond between Marcus and Shadow was strong, and people in the neighborhood admired it. They would often see Marcus talking softly to the dog, almost as if Shadow could understand every word. And in a way, he did. Shadow always knew when Marcus was sad, when memories of his past came back to trouble him. On those nights, when Marcus sat alone on the porch staring into the dark, Shadow would rest his head on Marcus's leg as if to say, "You're not alone. I'm here." Marcus lived simply. He didn't drive fancy cars or wear expensive clothes. His house was small, and he spent most of his money on keeping Shadow healthy and strong. He cooked his own meals, read books from the library, and worked part-time as a mechanic at a local garage. The neighbors thought of him as the quiet man with the dog. Nobody guessed that this man had once commanded missions that governments never admitted to the public. But Marcus preferred it that way. He wanted to be ordinary now. He wanted to bury the part of him that had lived with danger, violence, and loss. Only his closest friend, an older veteran who lived 2 streets away, knew the truth about Marcus's past. That friend, Mr. Harold, sometimes joked with him, saying, "If people here knew who you really were, Marcus, they'd treat you like a superhero." Marcus would only smile and reply, "I've had enough of that life. I'm just a man with his dog now." Every day followed a peaceful routine. Marcus would wake up early, make breakfast, and feed Shadow. Then they'd go for their morning walk. Shadow would bark at the squirrels, and Marcus would laugh softly at his silly dog's excitement. They'd stop by the park, where Marcus sometimes threw a stick for Shadow to fetch. Children would run up to pet him, and Marcus always made sure Shadow sat calmly before they touched him. The dog loved the attention, and the parents trusted Marcus because of his calm presence. In the evenings, Marcus and Shadow would sit on the porch, watching the sunset. Sometimes a neighbor would wave, and Marcus would wave back. Life was quiet, predictable, and safe, exactly what Marcus wanted after a lifetime of war. But inside, deep down, Marcus knew that peace was fragile. He knew from experience that life could change in an instant. In his years as a commander, he had seen quiet villages turn into battlefields in just one night. He carried that awareness with him, even though he hoped he'd never see such chaos again. Shadow helped him keep that fear at bay. With his dog by his side, Marcus believed he had finally found the peace he had been searching for. Marcus's story up until now was one of healing. He had gone from being a man who lived every day under the shadow of death to a man who found joy in small things: a cup of coffee, a wagging tail, the sound of kids laughing in the park. But destiny has a strange way of testing people when they least expect it. Marcus had no idea that the simple, quiet life he had built was about to be shaken. The one thing that anchored him, the one bond he cherished, was about to be threatened in a way he could never forgive. For now, though, Marcus only saw the peace around him. He leaned back on his porch chair, Shadow lying peacefully at his feet. The dog's ears perked up at every sound: a passing car, a bird in the tree, or a neighbor shutting their door. Marcus smiled, reaching down to scratch Shadow behind the ears. Life was good. After years of war, he had finally found his home. But life has a way of testing even the strongest men. And Marcus, though quiet, though peaceful, though trying his best to bury his past, was still a warrior deep inside. He did not know it yet, but the day was coming when that warrior would be forced to rise again. The evening was cool, and the sun was setting behind the trees, painting the sky with shades of orange and purple. Marcus had just finished fixing a neighbor's lawnmower earlier that day and was enjoying a quiet walk with Shadow. The street was calm, and the sound of crickets had already begun. For Marcus, these walks were like therapy. They helped him clear his mind and enjoy the present moment. Shadow walked proudly by his side, tail moving gently, ears alert but relaxed. From time to time, Marcus would stop and let Shadow sniff around the bushes or greet another neighbor. People always smiled when they saw Shadow. He was a large dog but carried himself with calm confidence, just like his owner. That evening, as they turned a corner, Marcus noticed a police car parked near a driveway. Two officers stood outside, talking to each other. They didn't seem to be handling an emergency, it looked more like they were just watching the neighborhood. Marcus didn't think much of it. He kept walking, Shadow close to him. But soon, the officers noticed Marcus. Their eyes followed him, and one of them stepped forward. "Hey, you," the officer called out. "What are you doing around here?" Marcus stopped, surprised by the sharp tone. He had lived in the neighborhood for years and had never been spoken to like that. Calmly, he replied, "Just walking my dog, officer. I live down the street." The other officer, younger and less patient, narrowed his eyes. "We've had reports of suspicious activity around here," he said. "You sure you're not trespassing?" Marcus felt a small wave of irritation but kept his voice steady. "I assure you, I live here. Everyone knows me. This is Shadow, my dog. We walk here every evening." Shadow, sensing the tension, stood closer to Marcus. He wasn't growling, but his posture was protective. The officers seemed to interpret it differently. The younger one frowned. "Control your dog," he said sharply. Marcus placed his hand gently on Shadow's back, signaling him to stay calm. "He's under control," Marcus said softly. "He's never been a threat to anyone." But the air grew heavier. The officers exchanged glances, and Marcus could sense that they were looking for trouble where none existed. He had seen this kind of behavior before during his years of service, people using power not to protect, but to intimidate. One of the officers stepped closer, as if trying to test Marcus's reaction. Shadow barked once, a deep, sharp bark that came more from instinct than aggression. He wasn't attacking, but he was warning. To Marcus, it was natural. To the officers, it was fuel. "Hey! Get that dog back," the younger cop shouted, his hand moving toward his holster. Marcus raised his hand quickly, his voice calm but firm. "He's fine. He's not dangerous. Please, don't overreact. He's just doing what dogs do when they sense tension." But the younger officer didn't listen. His eyes were locked on Shadow, not on Marcus's words. In a flash, his weapon was drawn. "No, don't!" Marcus shouted, taking a step forward. The sound of the gunshot echoed through the quiet neighborhood. It was so sudden that Marcus felt as though the world had stopped for a moment. Shadow yelped, a heartbreaking sound that cut Marcus deeper than any wound he had ever suffered in battle. The dog collapsed at his feet, his body trembling. Marcus dropped to his knees, gathering Shadow in his arms. His hands shook as he held the only companion who had been with him through everything. "Stay with me, boy, stay with me," Marcus whispered desperately. But he could already feel Shadow's life slipping away. The neighbors came out of their houses, shocked by the gunfire. Some shouted, some gasped, but all eyes were on Marcus kneeling on the pavement with his dog. The two officers stood frozen for a moment, one holding the smoking gun, the other shifting nervously as if realizing the gravity of what had just happened. Marcus lifted his face toward them, his eyes full of pain and disbelief. "You didn't have to do this," he said softly, his voice breaking. "He wasn't a threat. He was my family." The older officer stepped forward, trying to sound firm. "Your dog was aggressive. We had no choice." Marcus stared at him in silence. His years of training taught him to control his emotions, but inside, his heart was on fire. He had faced enemies in combat zones, but nothing compared to the helplessness he felt now. Shadow had been innocent. Shadow had trusted him to protect him. And now, he was gone. The younger officer, perhaps realizing the crowd was watching, muttered something about filing a report and turned away. The two of them walked back to their car, trying to appear in control, but their faces showed unease. They had no idea who Marcus really was. To them, he was just another man they could intimidate. Marcus remained on the ground for a long time, holding Shadow, whispering to him until the dog's body became still. Tears fell silently, mixing with the dust on the pavement. The neighbors stood in silence, some recording with their phones, others shaking their heads in disbelief. They had always seen Marcus as calm, kind, and gentle. They had never seen him broken. When Marcus finally stood, his arms heavy with grief, he carried Shadow back to his porch. He didn't shout, he didn't fight, he didn't threaten. He simply walked, his face unreadable, his body strong even in sorrow. People moved aside as he passed, realizing that something deep and powerful was happening within him. That night, Marcus sat on his porch with Shadow's collar in his hands. He stared at it for hours, replaying the moment again and again in his mind. Every instinct in his body told him that he could have stopped the officers if he had chosen to act like the soldier he once was. But he had promised himself he would never use those skills again, never go back to that life. He had wanted peace. But peace had been taken from him in the most painful way. The one thing he loved most had been destroyed before his eyes. And the men who did it walked away without a second thought. Deep inside, the commander he had buried began to stir. The part of Marcus that had once been the most lethal soldier in the Delta Force was not gone, it had only been sleeping. And now, as he sat in silence with his grief, he could feel it waking up. He did not want revenge. He did not want violence. But he wanted justice. And justice, he knew from years of experience, required more than words. The world had just reminded him of who he truly was. For the first time in years, Marcus felt the fire he had once carried in the battlefield returning. He knew the days ahead would not be quiet. He knew that the men who had taken Shadow's life had no idea what kind of man they had provoked. And as painful as it was, he also knew one truth: his life of peace was over. The morning after Shadow's death was heavy and silent. Marcus sat at his kitchen table, staring at the empty food bowl that once belonged to his loyal companion. Every morning, Shadow would sit by his feet waiting patiently for breakfast. Now, the bowl sat untouched, a painful reminder that his best friend was gone. Marcus held the dog's collar in his hand, running his fingers over the metal tag. The neighborhood was quiet outside, but inside Marcus's heart, there was a storm. He had faced loss before. He had seen brothers in arms fall in battle. He had carried soldiers to safety while bullets flew around him. But this was different. This wasn't a war zone. This was his home, his peaceful life, the world he had built carefully after years of fighting. And the loss hadn't come from an enemy across the ocean. It had come from people who were supposed to protect. That thought cut deeper than any wound he had carried from the battlefield. The neighborhood was buzzing with whispers. The gunshot from the night before had shaken everyone. Some people had filmed parts of it on their phones. Others had seen everything with their own eyes. The story spread quickly: the quiet man's dog had been shot by police officers for no reason. Many felt anger, but they also felt helpless. They didn't know who Marcus really was. To them, he was just a man grieving on his porch. But not everyone was unaware. Later that day, an older veteran named Harold knocked gently on Marcus's door. Harold had known Marcus for years. He was one of the few who had glimpsed the truth about Marcus's past. When Marcus opened the door, Harold didn't say much at first. He simply placed his hand on Marcus's shoulder. "I heard," he said quietly. "I'm sorry, son. I know what that dog meant to you." Marcus nodded, his voice low. "He was my family, Harold. They took him from me like he was nothing." Harold sighed and looked at him with eyes that carried wisdom. "They don't know who they messed with." Marcus shook his head. "That doesn't matter. I'm not that man anymore. I left that life behind. I just wanted peace." "But peace doesn't mean letting injustice win," Harold said firmly. "I served long enough to know that sometimes the fight comes to you, whether you want it or not. And when it does, you can't run from it." Those words stayed with Marcus. He didn't answer right away. He just closed his eyes, and for a moment, he remembered his old life. Images flashed in his mind: the sand-colored deserts where he had led his men into missions, the nights of planning under red lights in hidden tents, the quiet operations in foreign cities where one wrong step could cost everything. He had been a commander, trusted with lives and missions that others couldn't even imagine. He had earned medals that he kept locked away in a box, medals he never showed anyone. To the world, those missions didn't exist. But Marcus knew every scar, every sacrifice. For years, he had buried that part of himself. But now, it was resurfacing. As the day went on, more neighbors came to check on him. Some brought food, others just offered words of sympathy. They all noticed the deep sadness in his eyes, but they also noticed something else: a quiet intensity, like a flame being reignited. People began to whisper to one another. "Do you know who he really is?" some asked. "I heard he was in the military." "No, more than that, he was in something special. The kind of missions we'll never hear about." By evening, the story had spread further. A younger man from the neighborhood, whose uncle had served in the army, recognized the name Marcus Cole. He remembered hearing about him years ago: the commander who had led impossible missions, the man who soldiers spoke about with respect. "If that's him, the young man said to his friends, then those cops picked the wrong man to mess with. Meanwhile, the police officers who had shot Shadow filed their report at the station. They wrote that the dog had been aggressive, that they had acted in self-defense. They assumed it would be another routine case, brushed aside like so many others. They didn't know that people were already questioning their story. They didn't know that Marcus had a past that made him far from ordinary. That night, Marcus sat alone in his living room. The television was on, but he wasn't watching. He was lost in thought. He remembered Shadow's eyes, the way the dog had looked at him in his final moments, as if trusting him one last time. Marcus clenched his fists. He had promised himself he would never go back to being the man he once was. But now, he wondered if he had a responsibility. Not just for Shadow, but for the truth. The next morning, Marcus made a decision. He walked to the garage and pulled out an old trunk he hadn't opened in years. Inside were reminders of his past life, photographs, patches, maps, and a few medals. On top of everything lay a folded American flag, one he had received at the funeral of a fellow soldier. Marcus stared at it for a long time. Then he set it aside and reached deeper. He found a notebook filled with contacts, old teammates, people who had gone on to other important roles. Men and women who still respected him. He didn't plan to call them yet. But just knowing that he could gave him strength. In the neighborhood, curiosity grew. A group of residents began discussing holding a meeting to demand accountability from the police. Some wanted Marcus to lead the effort. He's strong. People will listen to him, they said. But Marcus wasn't ready to step forward publicly. Not yet. Instead, he began quietly gathering information. He walked back to the corner where Shadow had fallen. He examined the spot carefully, noting angles and distances the way his training had taught him years ago. He studied the bullet holes and the position of the police car. The neighbors watched silently as he moved with precision, almost like an investigator. To them, it became clearer, Marcus wasn't just any man. Later that evening, Harold returned. "You're thinking like a soldier again," he observed. Marcus gave a small, tired smile. "Old habits never really go away." Harold nodded. "Then maybe it's time to use them. Not for war. For justice." The turning point had begun. Marcus was no longer just grieving. He was preparing. His quiet life had been shattered, but the commander within him was waking. And though he didn't say it out loud, the truth was becoming clear. The men who had taken Shadow's life had no idea that they had provoked someone who had once been one of the most lethal warriors in the world. The days after Shadow's death were restless for Marcus. Sleep barely came, and when it did, his dreams were filled with echoes of gunshots and the image of Shadow collapsing into his arms. He would wake up in the middle of the night, sitting upright with his fists clenched, his breathing heavy. Every time he looked at Shadow's collar on the table, he felt both sorrow and resolve. He knew one thing for certain: he could not let this injustice be buried. The police officers who had shot Shadow walked around as if nothing had happened. They filed their report claiming they had acted in self-defense. The local station treated it like another minor incident, just another line in their records. But what they didn't realize was that this time, the man they had crossed was not ordinary. Marcus had been silent at first, but silence was not weakness. He was preparing. Marcus started his days with quiet observation. He walked the neighborhood again, not with Shadow this time, but with a sharp mind focused on details. He noted the exact time the officers patrolled the area, the kind of interactions they had with others, and how often they tried to intimidate people. What he found was troubling. The officers had a pattern. They pushed around those they thought were weak. They threatened without reason. People feared them but rarely spoke up because they thought no one would believe them. Marcus had seen this before in faraway lands, where men in power abused their authority. But this was his neighborhood, his home. He could not allow it to continue. Instead of confronting them directly, Marcus began quietly building his case. He spoke to neighbors, listening to their stories. One elderly woman admitted that the same officers had once threatened to fine her for sitting on her own porch too long. A teenager explained how they stopped him one night without cause and searched him roughly, only to let him go when they found nothing. These stories were small, but together they painted a bigger picture, a picture of abuse. Marcus carried a small notebook, jotting down every detail. His military training had taught him the value of patience and evidence. Justice wasn't only about strength, it was about strategy. And Marcus was a strategist by nature. Meanwhile, word of who Marcus truly was continued to spread. Veterans who had served in different units began to reach out to him. One of them, a retired intelligence officer named Daniels, came by his house. Daniels had heard about the incident through a friend in town. "I know you, Marcus," Daniels said. "I know what you're capable of. If you want to pursue this, I'll back you. You don't need to fight this alone." Marcus shook his head. "I don't want violence. I don't want to go back to that life. But I do want truth. I want justice for Shadow, and I want those men held accountable." Daniels smiled. "Then let's do it smart. The same way you used to plan missions carefully, with precision." Together, they began organizing. Daniels helped Marcus collect public records of complaints against the officers. To their shock, they discovered several prior reports of misconduct. Most had been dismissed or quietly filed away, but they showed a clear pattern of abuse. At the same time, Marcus began using his old network. He reached out to a former comrade who now worked as a journalist. Without revealing every detail of his own past, Marcus shared the story of Shadow's death, along with the other complaints he had uncovered. The journalist promised to look deeper, intrigued by the fact that the man behind the story wasn't just a grieving pet owner, but a decorated veteran with an unshakable reputation. As the days passed, the officers who had shot Shadow began to sense that something was happening. They noticed more eyes on them when they patrolled the streets. Neighbors whispered openly now, and Marcus's calm but firm presence made them uneasy. They didn't understand why the man they had dismissed so easily was suddenly gathering so much support. One afternoon, Marcus was approached by the same young man who had recognized his name earlier. "Mr. Cole," he said with respect, "people are looking up to you. They want you to lead. They're tired of being afraid. You're the only one who can stand up to them." Marcus placed a hand on the young man's shoulder. "It's not about leading. It's about doing what's right. If we stand together, they can't silence all of us." Encouraged, the young man spread Marcus's words through the community. Soon, more people began sharing their experiences. The neighborhood grew stronger, united by the belief that they could no longer stay quiet. Meanwhile, Marcus also studied the officers themselves. He didn't just watch what they did, he studied how they thought. He noted their overconfidence, the way they relied on intimidation, and the cracks in their discipline. To Marcus, it was like analyzing an opponent before a mission. He understood their weaknesses. They weren't strategic. They acted on impulse. And that, he knew, would be their downfall. The turning point came when Marcus's journalist contact published an article. It told the story of a decorated veteran who had lost his dog to careless policing. It included witness accounts, neighborhood voices, and even hinted at Marcus's history without revealing classified details. The article spread quickly. People in nearby towns read it, veterans groups shared it, and soon it caught the attention of state authorities. The police department tried to dismiss the article as exaggerated, but pressure began to mount. Reporters started showing up in the neighborhood, asking questions. Cameras caught the officers trying to avoid attention. For the first time, they were the ones feeling the weight of scrutiny. Through it all, Marcus remained calm. He did not yell, he did not threaten. He spoke clearly whenever asked for comment. "I am not seeking revenge," he told a reporter. "I am seeking justice. My dog was more than a pet, he was my family. No one should lose family to reckless behavior." His calm strength impressed people across the state. The officers grew nervous. They realized their simple report was no longer enough to protect them. They had underestimated Marcus, thinking he was just a quiet man with a dog. They never imagined they had provoked someone with the discipline of a commander, the intelligence of a strategist, and the respect of an entire community. Behind the scenes, Marcus continued to collect evidence. He filed formal complaints, backed by video recordings from neighbors' phones. He presented timelines and patterns of misconduct, showing not only what happened to Shadow but also the history of abuse in the department. Each step was deliberate, precise, and unstoppable. The community rallied behind him. They organized peaceful gatherings, holding signs that read "Justice for Shadow" and "Protect, Don't Harm." People who had once been silent found their voices because they saw Marcus standing tall. He didn't push them into anger. He guided them with calm determination. In his heart, Marcus still grieved. He still missed Shadow's presence every morning and every evening. But now his grief was turning into fuel. It gave him the strength to keep moving forward. He had promised himself he would never fight again, but he now understood that sometimes fighting didn't mean guns or fists. Sometimes fighting meant truth, persistence, and courage. The police officers had no idea how far Marcus was willing to go, or how much support he was quietly gathering. They thought they had silenced a man. Instead, they had awakened a commander. The balance was shifting. The officers who once walked the streets with arrogance were now the ones glancing over their shoulders. And Marcus, though still grieving, stood taller than ever, his quiet power stronger than their badges or weapons. The weeks that followed were unlike anything the small neighborhood had ever experienced. What began as a quiet man grieving his dog had grown into a movement for justice. News cameras lined the streets. Reporters stood outside with microphones, telling the world about Marcus Cole, a decorated veteran who had once led dangerous missions overseas and now stood firm against injustice in his own town. Marcus never sought attention, but he understood the power of it. When reporters asked him questions, he spoke with calm dignity. "This is not just about my dog," he would say. "This is about accountability. No one should live in fear of those who are supposed to protect them." His voice carried strength, and people across the country listened. Behind the scenes, the evidence Marcus had gathered grew stronger. Video clips from neighbors, written statements, and public records of past complaints against the same officers were put together like puzzle pieces. The picture was clear: this wasn't an isolated mistake. It was a pattern. And now the truth was too large to ignore. State investigators arrived. They questioned the officers, reviewed the footage, and examined the false report they had written. Their arrogance began to crack. The younger officer, the one who had pulled the trigger, grew nervous. His confidence faded when he realized people were no longer believing his story. The older officer tried to defend him, but the weight of evidence was too much. Marcus never confronted them directly. He didn't need to. The truth itself was confronting them every day. They avoided his eyes whenever they passed through the neighborhood. The community that had once been silent now stood united, watching every move they made. The officers had lost the power they once held, and it shook them to their core. A hearing was scheduled at the courthouse downtown. On the day of the hearing, dozens of neighbors came to stand with Marcus. Some carried pictures of Shadow, others held signs that read, "Justice for Marcus and Shadow." Veterans groups from across the state also showed up, men and women in uniform caps who had never met Marcus personally but had heard his story and wanted to stand beside him. Inside the courthouse, the atmosphere was tense. The officers sat at one table, their lawyers whispering nervously. At the other table sat Marcus, calm and steady, dressed in a simple suit. He carried no anger in his expression, only determination. When called to speak, he rose and walked to the front. He spoke softly but firmly. He described Shadow not just as a dog, but as family, a companion who had helped him transition from a life of war to a life of peace. He explained how Shadow was calm and well-trained, how he had never harmed anyone. And then he described the night of the shooting, every detail clear, every word measured. He didn't raise his voice, but every person in that room could feel the weight of his truth. "I served this country for decades," Marcus said. "I faced enemies abroad. I survived missions that tested every ounce of my strength. But I never imagined that in my own neighborhood, in the place I chose for peace, I would lose my best friend to the very people who are meant to serve and protect. This was not just a mistake. This was carelessness. This was abuse of power. And it cannot be ignored." The room was silent when he finished. Even the judge, who had listened to countless testimonies, looked moved. The neighbors in the audience nodded, some wiping tears from their eyes. Marcus did not beg for punishment. He simply demanded accountability. In the days that followed, the decision came. The younger officer was stripped of his badge and faced charges for misconduct and false reporting. The older officer was suspended and later dismissed for his role in covering up the truth. The department itself came under review, forced to address its culture of intimidation. It was a victory, not just for Marcus, but for everyone who believed in fairness. When the news reached the neighborhood, people gathered outside Marcus's home. They clapped, some cheered, and many thanked him for having the courage to stand up. Marcus didn't see it as his victory alone. "We did this together," he told them. When a community stands as one, truth always finds its way forward. But even with justice served, Marcus's heart still ached. Every morning, when he stepped onto his porch, he still looked for Shadow out of habit. The silence where his dog used to bark was heavy. No court decision could bring Shadow back. Yet Marcus knew he could not let his grief end only with sorrow. He had to transform it into something meaningful. With the help of Harold and Daniels, Marcus started a foundation in Shadow's name. Its purpose was to provide service dogs for veterans who struggled after returning home from war. He wanted other men and women like himself to experience the healing power of a loyal companion. The foundation quickly gained support. Donations poured in from people who had followed Marcus's story, touched by his strength and compassion. On the day of the foundation's opening, Marcus stood before a small crowd. Behind him was a banner that read "Shadow's Promise." He held Shadow's collar in his hand as he spoke. "My dog gave me peace when I thought I would never find it again. He reminded me that even in the darkest times, loyalty and love can guide us back to life. This foundation will carry his memory forward, helping others find the same light." Applause filled the air. Some veterans stepped forward, shaking his hand with gratitude. They told him how much this would mean to them, how dogs had already saved their lives in small but powerful ways. Marcus felt something in his heart heal, little by little. Shadow's loss still hurt, but now his memory was creating hope for others. As time went on, Marcus returned to his routine, though it was different without Shadow. He still woke early, still walked through the neighborhood, but now children and neighbors often walked with him, showing their support. He was no longer the quiet man everyone overlooked. He had become a symbol of resilience, someone who proved that even in the face of injustice, dignity and courage could lead to change. One evening, Marcus sat on his porch, the sky glowing with the colors of sunset. He closed his eyes and felt the gentle breeze against his face. In his mind, he could almost hear Shadow's bark, feel the dog resting by his side. He smiled softly, knowing that though Shadow was gone, his spirit lived on through every step Marcus took, through every veteran helped by the foundation, and through every person who found the courage to stand up for what was right. The world now knew Marcus Cole not just as the quiet man with a dog, but as a man who had once been one of the most lethal commanders in Delta Force, and who chose to use his strength not for revenge, but for justice. His story reminded everyone that true power does not always come from force. Sometimes it comes from integrity, from patience, and from the willingness to protect what is right even when it costs you dearly. Marcus leaned back in his chair, the collar still on the table beside him. He whispered softly, "Thank you, Shadow. You'll always be with me." And with that, he found peace once more, not the fragile peace he had before, but a deeper one, built on truth, courage, and the memory of a friend who had changed his life forever.